I call David Seymour.
Mr Chair, any member of a House of Representatives has to balance the competing prerogatives of the people that they specifically represent, of their political party and its philosophy, and of their own, and their own conscience. And this is the first time that I voted against a bill introduced by the National Party, because the people I directly represent generally believe that it's better to have these people over here and those people over there. And by and large, I would agree with their analysis. I am, after all, from Epsom myself. However, as somebody who benefits from a free society and a long evolved common law tradition, I believe the right thing to do is to oppose this bill and at the very least remove some of its most egregious features. Mr Chair, in time, I predict that this legislation will come to be seen as a useful case study in bad lawmaking. It is the classic case. First, you have the dramatic event to which people feel the need to respond. And we've actually heard it tonight, perhaps unwittingly. They didn't mean it to come out, but it came out from some members. We have to do something, is the major premise. This is something, is the minor premise. The conclusion is passing this law must be the right thing to do. And then you have the hand-wringing, and then you have the legislation, and finally you end up in a very different place from where you started. It might also, Mr Chair, be an insight into why our profession, if it can be called that, only just slipped in front of the journalists when the public were asked to rank professions in public trust very recently. And that is that we tend to overpromise. The promise implicit in this bill is that we in this House can set up an approved agency that will actually solve one of the biggest problems that we have. And the rhetoric is that if you don't support the bill, then you are in favour of the most awful things that occur. Well, I see Mr Bishop and I both quoted Milton Friedman in our maiden speeches saying that policy should be judged not by its intentions, but by its outcomes. And the outcomes of this legislation, were it to be passed in its present form, might be compared to the Star Chamber. You see, history doesn't repeat, but sometimes it rhymes. And this is not the first time that in our constitutional history, our society has attempted to solve a problem by giving easy and convenient access to justice without the safeguards and restraints that have evolved elsewhere in common law over a long period of time. And of course, if you know your history, what happened is that the Star Chamber became a bully pulpit which was used by the politicians of the day to cow their opponents in fear and submission. And so we see it is, while fortunately we are no longer in medieval England, the same principled deficiencies exist in this piece of legislation. I would direct members to the communication principles which would be appropriate if we were about to embark on a school camp, but not for running a country. They tell us that it is wrong to disclose sensitive personal facts about another individual, for example. They say you should not be indecent or obscene, or that you should not harass another individual. In their totality, and it only requires one of them to be breached for you to be reported, they mean that practically any digital communication could be subject to the full force of this approved authority. And of course, the rhetoric from the proponents of the bill is always similar to the epithet, if you've got nothing to hide, then you've got nothing to fear. They say, oh, don't you worry, if you're being good, then this will not apply to you. And where you end up, just like they did with the Star Chamber, is that you end up with arbitrarily enforced bad law that can be used sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. It just depends who happens to be enforcing the law at any particular time. Mr. Chair.
David Seymour.
And of course, you might say, well, this is all worthwhile if only we believed that it was truly going to reduce harm and suffering. If you believed that it was going to be effective, then you might be willing to trade away some of the rights and freedoms that we have been lucky to inherit over a long period of time. But you only have to begin with a few of the simple practicalities. We've heard from members already about the difficulty of 48 hours being far too long on the internet. It reminds me of a quote from Top Gun. 10 minutes, BS 10 minutes, this thing will be over in 2 minutes. And the fact of the matter is, keep it clean, Mr. Nash. The fact of the matter is that the timeframes and the evolution of viral trends on the internet about which we heard from the first member speaking are far quicker than intervention can take place. The pace of development of new websites and new fora is so rapid that it's unlikely that we'll be able to enforce what Tracy Martin referred to as the invisible threats from the internet. Take, for example, the website Ask FM, where many young people voluntarily put themselves out, almost to be harassed, some would say. I've asked some young people, why on earth do you do this? And they say, well, actually, we want to go there, we want to address concerns, we want to argue. And of course, many of the most tormentorous questions they face came from invisible questioners, people that, as a practical matter, could not be identified. And so there you have a whole range of activity that this bill would have no effect on mitigating whatsoever, and yet, nonetheless, is a very real concern to young people. Interestingly enough, and this is another deficiency of this policy project we're going on, is that Ask FM have since introduced quite stringent safety and monitoring regulations voluntarily because it's not in their best interest to have people coming to their website and having bad experiences, ultimately. And so, again, we have underestimated the speed with which hosts will actually seek to improve the experiences that people have on their websites. But then you come to the question of criminalisation. And it is said that we have to be in favour of this bill because we have to do something for the children. Well, the fact of the matter is that criminal sanctions are only effective if you're seriously prepared to use them against the poster, as we've heard, or the perpetrator. And nobody in this House, I believe, is seriously willing to criminalise children. But that would be the proposition if criminalisation was supposed to be an effective sanction against bullying of children. So I oppose this SOP in part for procedural reasons. It is in some ways an improvement, although, as Mr Parker pointed out, is also a step backward for every step forward. I oppose this SOP for procedural reasons because, as members will know, I've put up another SOP which removes the criminalisation element. You can still have your approved agency, you can still have your resolution, but it removes the criminalisation and applies the criminal law to specific, testable, discoverable offences. If you take an intimate visual recording, with or without the consent of the person in the recording, and if you then perpetrate it or propagate it around the internet without their consent, perhaps without their knowledge, that is a crime. I don't think anybody in this House would say that that should not be a crime. But if we wish to address a certain mischief, let's address that mischief. And if we're prepared to do that, you never know, we might find ourselves making better law. Indeed, we might even improve the impression of our own profession that the public has, if rather than over-promising knee-jerk reactions to particularly high-profile scandals, we actually set about to make proportional responses to problems that really exist out there in our community, and that government and its agencies have an opportunity to actually fix while respecting our common law traditions.
Alfred Naru.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, thank you. It's an honour to take a call on the harmful digital communications